podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam. This is All Across America. All right. Well, Jim, welcome to All Across America.
Thank you for having me on.
So you're known as one of the foremost authorities on preparedness and prepping. You're the author of How to Survive the End of the World as We Know It, the founder of survivalblog.com. I got into prepping and preparedness. I was a Boy Scout. The motto is be prepared, and that's really stuck with me my entire life. Were you a Boy Scout? How did you get into this?
Yeah, I was a Boy Scout, but I really got into it just out of my upbringing. I grew up in Livermore, California, which is the home of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And I was the son of a nuclear physics experimenter. He worked with particle accelerators. Most of my childhood friends, their parents worked at Lawrence Lab, and a lot of them designed nuclear weapons. And to this day, Livermore has the highest number of privately owned fallout shelters of any city in the country. It's just a matter of the whole culture there, at least in the 1960s and 1970s. It all revolved around nuclear weapons, and I had a full appreciation of what they could do.
Yeah. I mean, was it almost like people there knew too much?
Well, I think they just had a full realization of what nuclear weapons could do. A lot of these guys attended in the early 1960s above ground nuclear tests and then later underground nuclear tests at the Nevada test site. In fact, there are flights every day, or there were, from the Livermore airport to the Nevada test site, flying people back and forth because the weapons were all designed at Lawrence Livermore, what was originally called Lawrence Radiation Laboratory. And then they were assembled at a place called Pantex, which is in North Texas. And then they were tested at the Nevada test site in southern Nevada. So they had Livermore's Air Force flying there, as they called it, flying back and forth every day, commuter flights, because that whole test series went on for so long.
And you were at a stint in the Army as well, did you not?
Yes, I was a Army intelligence officer. I've got my commission through ROTC, and I worked in live intelligence missions in Germany. It was West Germany at the time. This was back during the Cold War, and it really gave me an appreciation of how fragile our world is. Seeing, well, just reading country studies, and in fact, even helping to prepare some country studies, I really got an appreciation of the fragility of modern societies. And I came to the realization that our own nation was quite fragile because of our dependence on the power grid.
Right. So maybe you could walk us through the scenarios. I mean, speaking of the power grid, maybe you could walk us through the scenarios of when we would need to be prepared and what we would need to be prepared for, as you call it, the WSHTF. What does
Yes.
that acronym stand for?
That stands for when the Schumer hits the fan.
and the Schumer is
Yeah, that's
a polite term for something else.
Yes, exactly. Well, there's a lot of different things that could go sideways. What we're looking at right now, the biggest risk, I think, is economic, because we have just out of control federal spending. We have a national debt that's grown to enormous proportions. We're talking 37 trillion and climbing. So I think the economic threat is probably the greatest right now. We're at great risk of a stock market collapse and possibly a dollar collapse, where confidence would be lost in the US dollar as a currency unit. And if that happens, we'd be in deep, deep trouble, because the only way that the US Treasury would be able to keep turning over its Treasury paper internationally would be to offer higher and higher interest rates. And they can't afford to do that. It just it it's not sustainable for more than a year or two because we'd end up with mass inflation here in the country, probably Weimar scale hyperinflation. And that's what I spelled out in my first novel, Patriots.
And how would that lead to, let's say, failure of the electrical grid?
Well, you'd get to the point where if the currency is worthless, a lot of people are not going to show up for work. And a lot of those people will be public employees. We have
Mm.
the folks who run the power plants not showing up for work. In the case of nuclear power plants, the NRC regulations dictate that if staffing drops below a certain level at a nuclear power plant, they are by law required to shut that plant down. So all the
Wow.
nukes would go offline very quickly. I guess the last to go would probably be hydroelectric plants, but boy, all the fired plants would go offline if the railroads are no longer financially viable. The trains are going to stop rolling, and the vast majority of the coal that feeds coal-fired power plants they're not mine mouth plants. They're fed by mile-long trains of coal.
Oh,
Those stop
yes. Oh,
rolling,
yes.
the power grid's just going to drop. And we actually have 3 different power grids in our country. There's an eastern grid, a western grid, and a Texas grid.
Yes, yes. Texas is unique in having 90% of its power from one grid. So, I mean, maybe you could walk us through the days and weeks and months of something like a power grid shutdown.
Sure.
Before we do that, could we talk a little bit about solar flares? I mean, there was an article even in the New Yorker last year about solar flares and how that could lead to a grid shutdown.
Well, yes, very easily. The greatest risk there is at the transmission end, not the power production end of the grid. The transmission is over very long lines, and those power lines actually act as antennas to gather either EMP or the force of a solar flare. And that is coupled through those power lines to all the electronics downstream and everything electrical downstream, including the huge transformers that are used, the step down transformers that create 120 volt A and 240 volt AC out of the very high voltage long distance power grid transmission lines. So if either a solar flare hits those lines or an EMP from a nuclear attack hits those lines, it would absolutely fry large numbers of transformers. And the scary thing is, most of those transformers are no longer made in the United States. And right now, the lead time to order and take delivery of one of those transformers is about 3 years.
Oh my
And
goodness.
there's very few spares on hand. So that alone would be enough to take down the grid for an extended period of time. And then to get back to your previous question, what would that look like? Well, just imagine everyone who is on an oxygen concentrator no longer having access to it. Everyone who's on kidney dialysis, not getting kidney dialysis. Anyone who is in the summertime dependent on medical insulin, no longer having their insulin refrigerated. And you can kind of extrapolate from there. I mean, just think how many people have chronic illnesses.
Right.
We'll see a massive die off of people with chronic illnesses. And then in some of the northern states, if this were to happen in winter, you'd see lots of people freezing to death because these days, most people do not heat their home with firewood like I do.
Right.
So
Right.
the other thing, of course, is we'd see if the power grid goes down, we'll see a failure of municipal water supplies. All those water supplies all over the country are the vast majority of them are dependent on electric pumps to pump that water up to gravity tanks where it's fed back to neighborhoods. So suddenly people are going to be without water. It'll be within 3 or 4 days, those gravity tanks will be dry if the power grid goes down. Then toilets are no longer flushing, and then you've got a massive public health crisis. And in some of the southwestern states, if people don't have water, they're going to be refugees within about 72 hours because there's just no open sources of water available in a lot of these
Right.
communities. So you have massive numbers of people hitting the road going where? It is pretty obvious they're going to try to go to, that a few of them will have country cousins, but most of them are just going to flee out into the hinterlands, hoping to find refuge. And they'll be very poorly prepared, and they'll probably be desperate within a very short period of time because their their money will be worthless because we're talking hyperinflation. They will have very few supplies with them. Gas station pumps will not be working, so people are gonna be limited basically to 1 tank of gas, and where was that gonna leave most people? Maybe in the middle of nowhere, but probably in the suburbs or beyond, and so the urban areas will be uninhabitable very soon. The suburbs will be overwhelmed with refugees. A lot of those refugees are gonna become looters out of desperation. And we could see with, public employees not showing up, with fire department no longer functioning and police departments no longer functioning, we could see chaos on a grand scale, widespread looting. It'll be very ugly.
Yeah. Yeah. And how did you see precursors to this during COVID?
Well, COVID showed us a number of things. First, it showed us how fragile our supply chain was. You
Yes.
saw how quickly supermarkets shelves got cleaned out of certain items. If that stage of the COVID crisis had continued and intensified, the stores would have been stripped completely clean. We came within about 48 hours of that. And it was only because they loosened up some restrictions and got some 18-wheel trucks rolling that the stores got restocked. If it weren't for that, we could have seen an absolute, just locust style stripping of all the supermarkets nationwide. The COVID pandemic also showed us, just how susceptible people are to propaganda. And it also showed us how insular and insulated people can be when a crisis strikes. People have a tendency to just hunker down. Fortunately, the majority of people have a tendency to do what the government says, even at their own risk. So when I saw what happened with COVID, I saw kind of a preview of what might happen in the next crisis, whether it's another pandemic, whether it's a nuclear attack or a strictly limited EMP attack, whether it's a solar flare, whether it's an economic crisis that causes a collapse in the US dollar and the credit markets. A lot of the same events are likely to play out just like I described with the grid collapse. And a lot of the same preparations that most preppers take apply in any number of those scenarios. So
Right.
if you're prepared for an economic collapse, you're probably fairly well prepared for a pandemic that's spread person to person. Because just like in an economic collapse where you'd want to hunker down and not be in contact with people for your safety, in a pandemic, you don't want to be in contact with people for your safety for another reason. So a lot of those same preps apply. The only ones that are kind of different would, of course, would be for preparing for nuclear fallout in the event of any ground burst nuclear detonations. Among other things, I'm also a nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare officer.
Wow. Can you describe that?
Okay. I took a course in the Army qualified me as an NBC officer, nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare. And they ran us through a pretty intensive little program describing mainly the effects of nuclear weapons and chemical weapons. And to see just how devastating those can be. And we did it, of course, all in a military context in terms of, you know, in the military, people carry around protective masks on a regular basis, and they have mop suits in great big piles ready to put on at a moment's notice. In the civilian world, people don't have access to any of that. And to see how devastated military units would be and how non-mission capable they would become so quickly, if you extrapolate that to the civilian world, wow, the effects would be absolutely phenomenal. I mean, they would the die off there would be tremendous, especially in urban and suburban areas. And
And
that's, of course, one of the things that led me to want to live in a lightly populated area, and why I moved to such an area. And I live in what I call the American Redoubt, which is an area in the inland Northwest, which consists of Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. That group of states, I think, will actually, because of its low population density and plentiful water and a mixed economy with both agriculture, timber, and ranching, will probably fare the best in a absolute disaster situation. That region also has a abundance of hydroelectric power, and if any part of the country is going to have the power grid come back up following a grid collapse, it'll probably be the inland Northwest.
interesting. And I mean, these are very low populated places of the country. I mean,
Yeah,
particularly
incredibly low population density. I live in a county that's about the size of Delaware, but it only has 30,000 people, and 15,000 of those people live in the county seat.
right, right. And I mean, Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington State are very different from the western part of their state. I
Oh,
actually
very
had
much so, and that's why
ye
I didn't include the western halves of those states
yes.
as my recommended areas just because of the population density, even though water is even more plentiful in Eastern Oregon and Eastern Washington, but there's just far too many people for it to be viable in the event of a major disaster.
I had the executive director of the Greater Idaho Movement on the show, a few months ago, and that is the counties of the eastern part of the state of Oregon to secede and become part of Idaho.
Right.
For much of that reason, population, of course, drives culture, and yes, they are
Yeah,
very different parts of the state.
yeah, if you look at Eastern Oregon and Eastern Washington, culturally, economically, psychologically, politically, they're completely different than the western parts of those states. They are much more like Idaho, much more old-fashioned, much more self-sufficient, much more rural and agrarian, whereas the western parts of those states are more your trendy hipsters.
Right. And so, in terms of a retreat, as you call it, a survival retreat, what do you recommend that people look for?
Well, first and foremost is water. The ideal retreat would be in a lightly populated area that's primarily agricultural, farming country or ranching country, but with a reliable water source. Preferably, the very top of the list would be gravity fed spring water, where a spring is uphill from a house where you have water flowing year round with no pumps involved whatsoever. The next thing up from that would be probably a property with a shallow well from which you can hand pump. But a traditional hand pump is limited to 1 atmosphere depth, 33 feet of depth, that you can pump with a hand pump, a pitcher style pump. Anything deeper than that, you need a specialized pump where the pump cylinder sits in the bottom of the well, more like a windmill pump. And that pump would be powered by a sucker rod that goes up and down if it's a mechanical pump, or a electric pump, but would work as well. But of course, that adds a whole level of complexity because you'd need to have photovoltaic panels, a battery bank, all that just to get water. So water is absolutely at the top of the list for a retreat. You'd want a a like a traditional homestead with lots of fruit and nut trees, a large garden area, room for livestock, preferably a wood lot where you can cut firewood. So you're looking at a minimum of about 5 acres to have it be viable.
Mm,
Realistically, 20 to 40 acres is better. But then that property would have to be in a safe area geographically because we're worried about refugees in large numbers and looters coming out of the big cities. You wouldn't want to be on a major highway. In fact, preferably, you'd like to be back on a side road of a side road so you'd have plenty of warning if someone like that were coming into your area.
can you describe as much as you can, as much as you're willing to share, your retreat, how many acres? Do you have a is it spring fed?
I actually have a fairly small retreat. It's less than 40 acres, but we have national forest on 3 sides. So, we have a million-acre backyard, and there's just a few neighbors in our valley, and I know them all by name,
Yeah.
uh, for, a couple mile radius. There's just that very few of us. We know each other very well. We know we can trust each other. We know our strengths and weaknesses. We know what equipment we have available to share. And we really take care of ourselves because, again, I'm in a very lightly populated county. There's only one sheriff's deputy that handles this entire end of the county at daytime and another deputy at night. That's it. And if he happens to be at the far end of his patrol area, it could literally be an hour
Oh,
before he
yes.
was able to respond to a call here. So we really
Yes.
depend on ourselves for security. If a tree goes down across a county road, we don't call the county. We just break out our chainsaws and cut it up.
Yeah.
People depend on themselves and their neighbors quite a bit. And again, we know we can count on each other.
You talk about the book and the importance of community. Can you talk a little bit about that? And, it's very difficult to go it alone, particularly in these
Yeah.
sorts of
Well,
scenarios.
there's Mark, there's two different approaches at retreating. One is to try to absolutely disappear and be, invisible even to your neighbors, but that's almost impossible. You really need to have some sense of community. And I think the sense of community exists in rural neighborhoods and in small towns up to about 3 or 4,000 population. Above that, you kind of lose the sense of community. What you really want is a community that has a sense of what they call the we and the they, or the us and the them, where in a crisis, that community will pull together and kind of, you know, lock arms and be ready for, whatever comes. Once you get up above about 5,000 population, you lose that sense of community and it's every man for himself, or at least a sense of that. So I recommend that people either live in a spread out farming community or in a small town in an agricultural area with plentiful water and reliable power.
What do you recommend for, the millions of Americans that live in suburbs or live in big cities? What can they do?
Well, we live in the age of Starlink, so if you can telecommute, I strongly suggest you move. Move to a lightly
Mhm.
populated area and do it soon because it takes years to get a retreat set up to, plant fruit and nut trees, to start learning how to garden on a large scale, how to raise livestock. That all those skills take a long time to develop. But for anybody who can't relocate, I would recommend you do the very best you can to stock up where you are, be ready to hunker down where you are, but also have a plan B to bug out. And if you do decide to bug out, recognize the fact that you may only have one trip out of town with one trailer, perhaps, and you won't be able to come back for a second trip because by the time you do, the roads will be absolutely jammed. And as I mentioned before, people are going to run out of gas. So a lot of the freeways may turn into giant parking lots. So you may just have one trip out of town at the 11th hour, and you want to be one of the first ones to hit the road so you don't get stuck in that parking lot.
Right. And you talked about old technologies are appropriate technologies, and this is getting back to our earlier conversation about the pump for a well. I mean, I guess when things happen, you want things to be as basic, as foolproof, as few moving parts as possible.
Yeah, and especially if it's a long-term situation where, say, for example, the fuel refineries don't come back online, you could be out of gas literally for years. And that would mean people are going to start running out of gas for chainsaws if it got really, really bad. So we're talking traditional 19th century level technology, hand saws, hand tools, traditional agriculture, hand broadcasting of seed, hand harvesting, even hand hay cutting with a scythe and stacking hay traditionally. Those, again, are skills that take time to learn, and you really need to plan in advance because you can't just, uh, you know, uh, granted, people are going to set up forges and set up blacksmithies and all that sort of thing, but that's going to take time. In the short term, you're going to need those traditional tools and you're going to need lots of them. There's also going to be lots of family members who know that you're living where you do, and they're probably going to show up on on your doorstep at the 11th hour. You need to have everything they'll need because they're going to arrive with basically nothing. So you're going to need extra hand tools and lots of gloves. You're going to need extra bedding. You'll need to be set up to do cooking on a large scale, not just for your family, but probably the couple of or three families that might be sharing your house. It's going to be kind of cozy, but probably the way it's going to turn out for a lot of people who have retreats. It's just human nature that people are going to bug out and they're going to go where they know they have a chance to survive. And that's probably their crazy prepper buddy or crazy prepper relative. And you don't want to be in a situation where you're forced to turn away most people. I'm a big believer in Christian charity, so it's important that you stock up not just for your own family, but also for whoever else shows up. So, uh, best case, you'll be able to house them long term. Worst case, you just be resupplying them and sending them on their way, saying, "Sorry, we
Yeah.
don't have room."
So you talked about the concept of the crazy prepper, and I think maybe pre-pandemic it was met with a certain amount of ridicule. Has that changed in the last few years?
Oh, radically, yeah. The with COVID and then the invasion of Ukraine, people realized that the whole prepper mindset actually is just plain common sense.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess it depends on how far you take it. I mean, it's absolutely plain common sense. It can go to extremes, of course, like anything.
Yeah, well, we started off this conversation talking about the worst case, but just look at a repeat of the depression of the 1930s. That's fairly likely, and the grid stayed up, but there was still a lot of crime, and there was a lot of starvation, and a lot of absolute hardship. So people need to be prepared for anything lesser. And the good news is, if you prepare for the worst case, then you can take anything lesser in stride.
Yes. Yes. I mean, it's like training as an athlete in Boulder, Colorado at 6,000 feet and competition is at, sea level.
Right.
And so in terms of your larder, I mean, you've talked about the concept of two is one is none. I mean, how much food, how much backup, how prepared should the average family be?
I would like to see the majority of my readers put away at least a 2-year supply of food. But as I mentioned earlier, there's the need for Christian charity. So that 2-year supply for one family might turn out to be a 1-year supply for two families.
I mean, the problem with that is it's a huge expense, yeah, and everything is now being, essentially your money, your capital is being warehoused in your basement.
Well, yeah, there it has its own set of risks, but the advantages far outweigh the risks.
Yeah,
Even someone who, like me, who lives at a remote retreat needs to have a plan B, a bug out plan. In my case, my concern is forest fires, and we might have to bug out, at a moment's notice. So we've made plans for that. But for folks who stock up, they need to they need to do a number of things. First, they need to stock up in a way that it's going to last. They need to use all the the food storage techniques that I describe at Survival Blog to make sure that the grain you put away doesn't get eaten up by moth larvae. You want to store everything properly. You want to store everything quietly. You don't want, even if you live way out in the country where the majority of your neighbors are self sufficient, they might be self sufficient, but not all of them stock up in quantity. So you want to be very quiet about stocking up. And if you do dispense charity beyond your immediate family or your next door neighbors, you probably want to think about doing it through a third party so your name never gets mentioned. And I usually mention doing that through a local church where you would talk with the church elders and say, "Hey, I've got this extra food. This is a one shot deal. I'm going to be leaving it with you. You can dispense it to whoever you see fit, but my name will never be mentioned." And that has a couple of advantages. Of course, it enhances your privacy, your security, because you don't if you get known as the guy who has a 5-year food supply, guess who everybody's going to you know try to descend on.
sure.
So you want to be private about that, and it also fulfills a biblical mandate to not be prideful. So if your name is never mentioned, there's no sense of pride.
You talked about skills beating gadgets, and what would you say are the most, important skills to have?
Well, the most important ones, of course, are going to be self sufficiency skills, but you also need to be able to defend what you have. So there's tactical skills as well. And there's medical skills because if we're looking at a period of time where there's either no medical services available or no transport to get to those medical services over a distance, you're going to be on your own. It's what I call yo yo time. You're on your own. That's what that acronym stands for. So you need to have medical skills. You need to have communication skills for like ham radio and that sort of thing, where if the phone system is down, you need to have backup communications both locally so you can coordinate security with your neighbors and long distance. You want to have both shortwave listening capability and preferably HF transmitting capability so that you can talk to folks a long distance and gather intelligence from a distance. So those are the kind of skills that people will need. A lot of it are the old-fashioned skills that you find in things like the Foxfire books.
Right. Right. Great resource. I've got the full collection, I think 1 through 10. It went up many, many different volumes, but it is a great collection from the Appalachian region of the United States of basically 18th century homesteading and ways of living, everything from, pig butchery to candle making. It's all in there. Highly
Exactly.
recommend.
Yeah, our family just did some candle making over Thanksgiving. We had a bunch of family members visiting, and we had a lot of wax left over from when we separated honey from our beehives. We had a lot of beeswax left over, and we dipped beeswax candles. It was a lot of fun.
Can you survive on your homestead indefinitely?
Not indefinitely, no, because, we don't have a salt mine anywhere nearby. You know, we there there there's some things that we just can't provide ourselves with locally, and once our supplies run out, we would be forced to barter, at least barter over a long distance for things like salt, for
Yeah.
example. But in terms of general self-sufficiency, we're probably better off than the vast majority of Americans. I cut all my own firewood. We grow most of our own food. My wife has 2 large gardens. We have a large orchard. We raise several different types of livestock, up to and including, dairy cattle. So,
Wow.
and we have small livestock as well, with chickens and sheep, and some of our sheep are a combination wool, meat, and dairy breed. So
Wow.
we planned out things pretty well. We practice what we preach, really, in terms of our
Yeah.
lifestyle. We raised our kids here, homeschooled them, and taught them all these self-sufficiency skills. So, yeah, we also hunt and fish. We and we can forage for berries in the summertime, and morel mushrooms, and all sorts of things. I mean, there's and wild herbs and edibles. I think we'll get by just fine, probably for a period of 3 or 4 years.
Wow. And so your vulnerabilities that you mentioned are salt and forest fires. I mean, anything else that is of
Well,
concerning to you
in
and
the
your
long
specific.
term, there's gonna be some tools and electronics that wear out,
Yeah.
or batteries that will no longer take a charge.
Right.
There's limits to, well, for example, for a photovoltaic power system like we've got, I use mainly lithium iron oxide batteries, but even those have a shelf life and a useful working life. If I were to be using flooded lead acid batteries, traditional batteries, those really only have about a 9 or 10-year life. Well, beyond that, they just won't take a charge. They sulfate
Right.
and won't take a charge. So there are limits to how long you can be truly independent. And it's going to take faith and friends to survive. And those friends, hopefully, friends and neighbors, will be in a position to barter and hopefully fill in the gaps for what people are missing.
And so your home is heated by wood and you use solar and battery backup for electricity?
Yes. And we also have grid power here. And I've also got Starlink that I'm talking to you on right now. And a lot of things can be replaced or substituted or improvised, but some things just can't. And long term, there's going to be some things that we're going to run out of.
And so in terms of gear, I mean, you need gear beyond food and sustenance. What are your top recommendations for gear that folks have?
I'm sorry, my recommendations for what?
Gear.
Oh, for gear? Oh boy. I actually have a whole spreadsheet for that. If you go to survivalblog.com and you click on resources, there's a Excel spreadsheet called my list of lists. And it has very extensive lists of gear, supplies, various tools, training, all sorts of things. That's all included there. If I were to narrate part of that list, it would take up a couple of more hours on this interview.
Yes, yes.
But
Top
again, all the archives at survivalblog.com are available free of charge, and I highly recommend that your listeners dive in and dig deep. There's a lot there. It goes back now 20 years. I've been posting every day on Survival Blog for over 20 years.
what's changed in those 20 years? Have your recommendations changed? I mean, of course, we've talked about pitfalls of technology, but what's changed?
Well, the prepper mindset, I think, has kind of trickled. down into the other strata of society. Prepping used to be almost strictly a conservative Christian white folks thing, but now prepping is exercised by people across the political spectrum. You've got your Birkenstock wearing, granola munching, you know, urban ponytail kind of guys, as well as traditional conservatives. So that's changed. There's also a lot of new technologies that have enabled prepping, things like Starlink, for example. And the cost of photovoltaic panels has dropped tremendously.
Yes.
Photovoltaic panels are now well below $1 per watt. When I got started at this, when I put in my first photovoltaic power system at my first ranch near Orofino, Idaho, solar panels were about $12 a watt.
Wow.
So things have changed dramatically there. Again, and I mentioned battery technology has improved as well. Inverter technology has improved. Inverters are much more efficient than they used to be, and they produce much more clean power. So you can actually run things like computers off of an inverter because they give you what they call pure sine wave power rather than choppy sawtooth wave power, which is what they call dirty power. So the technology has come a long way as well. Some technologies have improved both as benefits and also as risks, like night vision technology. If you've got it, great. If you don't and your opponent does, you're in deep trouble because
Mm.
they'll own the night and you won't, and they'll take full advantage of you and you lose. So a lot of that technology has come a long way. And more recently, drone technology has come along, and even thermal night vision equipment has come along and become affordable. So a lot of technologies are advancing. But to get back to Starlink, for example, that's a lot of people's ticket to living out in the boonies because they
Right.
can now telecommute, and that's available literally nationwide and well up into Canada and Alaska. You can get Starlink now. And Starlink only draws about, even with the traditional Starlink, I think it's about 70 watts. With the new Starlink Mini, I think it's under 40 watts. So even a small photovoltaic power system with a modest sized battery bank is more than enough to power that. So you could live fully off grid, not even have to have any grid power at all, and still have good year-round communications and internet access, the whole works. So you don't have to live like a caveman. The technology is there.
Yeah. Yeah. You've talked about, I mean, just getting into night vision goggles and defense, and you dedicate a large part of your book, How to Survive the End of the World as We Know It, to home security and self defense. What are your top recommendations there?
Well, if you don't own a gun, buy one and get good with it.
Mm,
And the sheer number of guns that people have, and even the sheer amount of ammunition they have, is not nearly as important as being competent with that gun. I often like to say that owning a gun and not having the training is like someone who owns a surfboard. They can't call themselves a surfer if they've never surfed.
yeah.
Okay. You're not a surfer. You're just a guy who owns a surfboard. And if you don't have the training to go along with the guns you own, you're really not going to be much of an asset at all. In fact, you might even be a liability if you're not a safe shooter.
Oh, absolutely.
So you really got to train with what you have, become fully confident and competent tactically, and you really need to think through situations where you might have to use lethal force and just pray really hard that you never have to. And
Do
again,
you?
you want to have night vision equipment, and in a worst case, you want to have helmets and level 3 or preferably level 4 body armor for everyone in the family. If you know you're going to be attacked, it's time to strap all that on so you have a better chance.
Do you feel like being without food and water just brings out the worst elements of human nature that we revert back to our animalistic instincts?
I'm afraid so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially, we live in a very urbanized society, and I've seen things change just in the 20 years that I've been running Survival Blog. We have a more urbanized society. We have a whole generation of young people that have grown up that don't even know how to drive a manual transmission vehicle or even read an analog clock, much less change their own tires or, the skills just aren't there. So people are much more systems dependent. People are absolutely addicted to their smartphones, and I think they'll go into withdrawal when those go away. So we're really at great risk now, and the risk keeps increasing with every passing year. And the risk to EMP and solar flares keeps increasing as well because of advances in microcircuit technology. The individual there's not just thousands, but now hundreds of thousands of transistors on every chip.
Mm.
That that the dimensions of those chips have kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller with every passing year. About 15 years ago, we got submicron. Now we're down to less than a third of a micron for each transistor gate. But here's the bad news. The smaller the gates, the more the vulnerability to not just static electricity, but to EMP or solar flares. So as those chips have become more and more sophisticated and they pack more and more microcircuits and more transistors onto each chip, their vulnerability to EMP keeps increasing. So it we live really in a house of cards, and I think it make technology can be a wonderful thing, but it may come back to bite us.
What do you say, and have you consulted with people who run electrical grids, who run municipal water, utilities? How can they be prepared on behalf of the people they serve?
Well, actually, a lot of the small power co-ops in places like I live are actually ready for what they call failover. Any area that exports power can island the power they have. So if you look at like Farmington, New Mexico, right, where they have all this natural gas and a little hydroelectric power, they export power, and the entire Northwest exports power. Most of the rest of the country imports power,
Mm.
and they're going to be out of luck if the grid goes down. But in the areas where they produce power, a lot of these utilities are set up for almost automatic failover. If the grid goes down, the local grids around the hydroelectric dams, for example, will come back up within less than a minute. They're set up for what they call failover, and they have what they call islanding the power. They become a little power island unto themselves until the rest of the grid can come back up, and then they can reconnect to the grid.
And how about municipal water sources? I mean, you talked about these pumps being
Yeah,
electric.
there's very few cities in the country that have gravity-fed water from end to end. And ironically, one of those is San Francisco, California.
Mm.
They get all their water from what's called the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir up in the high Sierras, and it's literally gravity-fed all the way down to the San Francisco Peninsula through massive pipelines. It ends up in Crystal Springs Reservoir and then gravity-fed back down to the city and county of San Francisco. But there's very few water supplies like that in the country. The vast majority of civic water supplies are dependent on grid power. People need to plan ahead and hopefully at least move to a place where they can have their own well and have their own photovoltaic power to pump water.
Yeah.
And then they'll
And
be in
what
a great position to help out their neighbors because they'll be able to have people come and fill up their containers.
And we talked a little bit about the importance of keeping a low profile. What are some of the measures that you can share that you've taken to protect yourself?
Well, we're very circumspect about what we talk about with our neighbors. I take my mail quite a distance away from where I actually live, so I publish a mailing address, but I have an hour drive to get there to pick up my mail.
Wow.
I live in a very remote area, and I don't mention where I live. So it it takes a little bit of, you know, you need to be circumspect and you need to choose what you say carefully and judge your audience about who you're talking to. If you're talking to a close friend or a relative, you could lay all your cards on the table. But for anyone else, you have to apply what the military calls the need to know rule. And if someone really doesn't truly need to know about your preps, it's great to encourage them, but there's no need to tell them exactly what your preparations have been.
What are some good resources for actually buying supplies, buying food? You mentioned your website, which is just a wealth of information, but where do you recommend people go in terms of brick and mortar, online stores where people can get stuff at quantity?
Sure. Well, if you look at my website, survivalblog.com, I have some longtime advertisers. Like one, for example, is in Eastern Tennessee. It's a company called Ready Made Resources, and they sell, wow, everything from night vision gear to hand pumps. They have it all. They have water filtration. They have storage food. They have an amazing inventory. Again, it's readymaderesources.com, just the way it sounds. They've been an advertiser on Survival Blog for more than 19 years.
Wow. And also, I'd imagine warehouse stores. I mean, like the
Oh, sure.
Costco and
You obviously could stock up at Costco or Walmart. You got to be careful though in terms of being circumspect. You have to assume that anything that you buy at Costco is going to end up, on a long-term record, probably a permanent record that might someday be available to government officials who suddenly develop an interest in cleaning out people's stockpiles of food.
yeah,
So, for any really important purchases like that, I usually buy directly from the companies that produce them. There's a number of them that I mentioned in my blog, like Rainy Day Foods, for example. They're located in Wyoming, right on the Wyoming-Idaho state line. They can literally deliver you a truckload of food,
wow,
and if you pay for that with cash or a cashier's check, there's really no permanent
right?
paper trail. Certainly not the kind of paper trail or the, God forbid, electronic paper trail that you would have if you bought that quantity of food at Costco or Sam's Club.
Right, right. I can just imagine ground zero for this movement has gotta be the Costco in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho.
I would assume so. But the nice thing about living in a place like North Idaho is there's far more preppers than non-preppers in a lot of these small towns.
Right.
So the number of people who rush to the stores at the last minute is going to be much lower. So every one of those families that prepared represents one less family that's rushing to the store at the 11th hour.
Yeah,
So instead of being part of the problem, they're going to be part of the solution. And
sure,
again,
sure.
if they're stocked up, they'll be in a position to dispense copious Christian charity.
And in terms of the importance of family, how supportive has your wife been through this, your children? What do people do if their, significant others
Really, it
aren't as
really
supportive?
It really should be a team effort, but if you've got a non-supportive wife, even after COVID, you really gotta wonder about your wife. If people should see how fragile society
Yeah,
is, but if they're still in
yeah,
denial, you can at least do some prepping on your own, and w it's mainly gonna be an issue. I don't normally see it within an individual nuclear family or just a couple. It's usually the extended family that's the issue, where you have Uncle Bob, who's anti-prepper who thinks that, you know, that tomorrow is gonna be just like today, and everything will be copacetic. But then when things actually hit the fan, he's going to be on your doorstep with his hat in his hand saying, "Oh,
Sure.
I'm sorry, I was wrong." Well, you've got to be in a position to help them out.
Yeah.
And that, again, it means stocking up a lot of extra stuff, but you don't want to be in a situation where you have to turn away someone, especially a blood relative.
Yeah. Do you feel like people's antagonism towards prepping is that they're uncomfortable with the idea that this could happen?
Well, that's part of it. And part of it is a deep seated guilt knowing that they haven't prepared.
Mm,
So they're antagonistic to prepping because they either feel envy secretly or they feel no real sense of self-worth in that department because they haven't prepared for their own family. So it's easier for them to lash out at someone who is prepared rather than admitting they were wrong and preparing for themselves. They'd much rather buy a big screen television and have a vacation in Hawaii and a jet ski.
Well, any final thoughts for folks listening?
Well, I just recommend that folks first get right with God because it really takes, again, faith and friends to get through
Mhm.
this. You need to, as a Christian, I believe you need to have faith in Jesus Christ and you need to pray fervently for God's guidance, providence, and protection because it's going to take that. I also think that people should seriously consider having a powwow with their spouse to begin with and sit down, talk about it, pray together, and make a plan, but don't feel overwhelmed. I have at my website, again, it's survivalblog.com. There's a link to a static page that's called, I think it's called the Quick Start Guide for Prepping Newbies. You don't feel overwhelmed. Don't feel you have to do all of this overnight. And of course, most people are not going to have the budget to do this overnight.
Right.
I do a lot of consulting for high net worth individuals, multimillionaires. A few of them have been able to build up full blown retreats in rural areas just from scratch within just a couple of years, but it takes a tremendous amount of money and hiring a lot of outside help. And by the way, that has its own OPSEC issues. But
Sure.
you folks who are on a, a normal middle class budget, don't feel overwhelmed. Just work at this piece by piece, starting with water filtration and food storage. Those are the most important first steps. And those preps apply to any kind of disaster situation.
Yeah. Yeah. You could survive a month without food, but just days without water.
Yeah.
Learn that as a Boy Scout. Well, that brings us full circle. Jim, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much for being on the show. It's survivalblog.com. Any other resources?
King James Version of the Bible.
All right. I think if this ever happens, you're going to need that book.
Yes, you will. But no, there's a lot of resources out on the internet. I don't want to sound, snide about that, but there's a lot of other resources out there, not just Survival Blog. There's a ton of YouTube videos available. But again, don't dig too deep. Don't feel totally overwhelmed, or you just feel like you'll get what in the army, what we used to call analysis paralysis. You don't want to overanalyze. You should get started and start out by just doubling up on the staple foods that you buy on a regular basis and stocking up.
All right. Be prepared. Jim, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Mark. And I pray the 91st Psalm for you and all your listeners.
All Across America is produced by me, Marco Vig, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Visit us on Instagram at All Across America. Check out our website, allacrossamerica.com. There's an interactive map with all our episodes, and there's a Contact Us page where you can send your reactions, guest ideas, and suggestions. So get in touch, stay connected. To me, that's what podcasting is all about. Thanks for listening.